A daily dose or tot of rum is one of the oldest traditions in the Royal Navy.
Chiefs and petty officers got it at 11 o'clock in the morning, because that was neat. They had a neat rum. And the troops got it at 12 o'clock, but that was watered. You had 2 parts of water to 1 part of rum. And ours came at 12 o'clock. And for some people that was a ritual. It was, they wouldn't miss their tot for any, I mean, they wouldn't go ashore. They must have their tot. And I've seen grown men who have been in the Navy years and years who stand there slavering at the mouth waiting for their tot, you know. Why, I don't know.
You get some of the youngsters hated the taste of it, couldn't go it, see. And of course you could buy it. See, instead of that, you could refuse it. But if you had it, somebody was always there to buy it off you. It's only 3p a time. See, you give them the thrums, you get the 2 in 1, you know. A couple of these, and oh,
Back on land, Londoners were also keeping their spirits up.
Morale was very high during the bombing. It remained very high, but sometimes after a particularly bad raid, I seem to recall when some of the houses were lying in the street, people had lost everything, but there was talk of giving up and getting out of the war.
I think people were really sincerely worried about whether there were going to be enough munitions, enough men, enough food, enough everything to survive without the United States assistance.
Joe Kennedy, the American ambassador to Britain, was convinced that the might of the German army would prevail and Britain would lose.
Of course, Kennedy caused a great deal of animosity here. And it was a very unhappy situation having him here as ambassador who was so anti.
You know, it gave British people quite a dislike for Joseph Kennedy. He was considered a bit of a traitor, really. But on the other hand, seeing the situation here in 1940, from his point of view, to me it seemed quite logical that he should look at the situation and say, well, these people are perilously ill-prepared to fight a war. And there they were, the unbroken might of the German army, 22 miles away, and the overwhelming air force. And Joseph Kennedy must have looked at it and thought, well, they can't do it, they can never win.
But opinion was very divided in the States about whether to come in or not, as you can imagine. If you're out in a place like Illinois, for instance, Europe seems very, very remote. President Roosevelt was very anxious to help in a quiet way without stirring the pot.
Churchill sent the former Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax and his wife across the Atlantic to try to persuade Roosevelt to help sooner rather than later. Norman Gray was an ordinary seaman on board their ship, HMS King George V.
The sea was quite nasty. It was a real rolling sea, and the ship was going from starboard port. The commander's given all the crew a make and mend, which meant that everybody could get their heads down and go to sleep. The chief messman and me, we got on top of the hot plate, made a little pillow one end, and laid down feet. And then about 3 o'clock, one of the OAs come in, he said, "What, no tea?" And another bloke said, "Yeah, make yourself a pot." As the kettle had boiled, as he walked across the pantry with it, there was a dirty great roll to starboard, and he planted the lot all on my feet and the chief messman's feet.
Norman Gray was taken to the ship's sick bay.
I always remember standing on this table while the doctor, a Canadian young doctor, was peeling my skin off with a pair of forceps. Lord and Lady Halifax came round, and Lady Halifax looked in my hammock and said, "What happened to you, lad?" And I said, "I got scolded by somebody pouring a kettle over me feet, you know." And she said, "Oh, you poor boy." And I thought, yeah.
With no American aid and supplies dwindling rapidly, Shepperton Film Studios was asked to help confuse the enemy, although at first they only confused the locals.
When war was declared in 1939, we were just finishing a film. It caused quite a stir in this area because half a dozen of the extras were dressed in Gestapo uniforms, and they walked down Shepperton High Street one lunchtime and nearly got killed down there by the people thinking that they were real ones. But as soon as that film was finished, then we didn't make any more films. The rest of the studio workers then went on to making decoy aeroplanes, tanks, gun sights, all made out of canvas and wood. And we used to make up these kits of so much nuts, bolts, washers, nails, screws, because each tank or each plane had a specified kit to make those jobs. So we used to make those up in the stores, put them into boxes, and then whenever they wanted so many of these kits, they'd come and draw them off us and take them and assemble them. And then people like my father, who was a painter then, they used to camouflage things like proper camouflage paint.
Decoys weren't restricted to planes and tanks. André Wadou admired British ingenuity in Scotland.
You know, people are always saying how cunning the French are. Well, the British can be just as cunning. In the harbour at Scapa Flow, there were these boats that looked like battleships and cruisers, but they were made out of wood. And the Germans took great pleasure in bombing these boats, thinking that they were doing lots of damage. But they weren't doing no such thing.
They were made so good, at about 50 or 60 yards, you would have thought they were real.
As 1941 dawned, Britain stood alone against the might of the German army. The British were good at keeping their spirits up, but now the odds were stacked in favour of the Germans winning the war.